All right, we'll go ahead and get started while we finish the live stream process. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ideas on Tap presented by the Museum of Natural and Cultural History. I'm Lauren, and I'd like to start this evening by recognizing that the museum and the University of Oregon are located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the museum and the university, to Oregon, and to the world. We express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all other displaced Indigenous people who call Oregon home. If you're new to Ideas on Tap, welcome. Although we might not be together in person, we still want to hear your questions and your comments. During this evening's program, you can use the Q&A and chat features on Zoom and Facebook to reflect on the talk or add your thoughts, to engage with other viewers, and to ask questions of our speaker. I'll be collecting your questions across both platforms, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. During the talk, we'll also post a link to a brief survey in the comments on both Zoom and Facebook. Please consider taking a minute or two to fill it out, even if you've filled it out before. Your feedback will help us improve future virtual programs, and you'll be entered to win a $25 gift card to Viking Bracket Company, where the museum hosted our Ideas on Tap program prior to the pandemic. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we're asking that you please consider making a secure, tax-deductible donation of $5 to $10 at the web address listed on the screen to help keep museum programs like this one accessible to all. That's giving.uoregon.edu/MNCHgift. Your donation directly supports the museum's educational programming, bringing science and culture adventures to Oregonians of every age and in every corner of the state. Thank you. On Thursdays in December, come and warm your spirits with the holiday fun throughout the museum at our holiday nights. On Thursday, December 9th, join local guidebook author Bill Sullivan for a meet and greet, book signing, and talk on Oregon's geology and natural disasters. The talk will begin at 6 p.m. and will also have family-friendly geology-themed games available. Then on Thursday, December 16th, we'll be joined by the Cascades Raptor Center and Lane County Audubon Society for family-friendly activities and information about your local backyard birds. You can explore the exhibits with a bird-themed scavenger hunt and make crafts to take with you. Exhibits and activities are included with regular admission. During our holiday nights events, admission is free with a non-perishable food donation per person for Food for Lane County. You can also purchase or renew a family membership at 20% off during these events. And remember, museum memberships make great gifts. And as an added bonus, members receive 30% off all non-consignment items in the museum store on every Thursday in December. So if you're not already a member, now's a great time to join. I hope you'll join me next month in the new year for our next Ideas on Tap. On Wednesday, January 5th, I'll be joined by psychologist Rita Ludwig for a discussion about how a planful pursuit helps people successfully achieve long-term goals and how you can too. If you have a New Year's resolution, you don't want to miss it. If you can't join us live, we'll post a recording to the museum's YouTube page the following day. All right, so if you've visited the museum lately, you might recognize my backdrop for tonight. I'm joining you all from the museum's newest exhibit, Magic in Medieval Europe. The museum is open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. and until 8 p.m. on Thursdays. If you have not had a chance to see the Magic exhibit, I encourage you to come and check it out. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Kersti Francis. Kirsty is a writer and medievalist currently completing her PhD in English at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research focuses on feminist theory, gender and sexuality studies, the history of science, and medieval literature. More specifically, Kirsty works on the intersections between magic, gender, and sexuality in the Middle Ages and the early English Renaissance from about 1100 to 1600. She joins us this evening to talk about gender, power, and magic in medieval Europe. Welcome, Kirsty.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I am absolutely thrilled to be here with you all. And before I begin, I, like Lauren, would like to acknowledge the unceded Indigenous land from where I give this talk. I'm currently located in Tucson, and this is Tohono O'odham land. While land acknowledgements are not praxis in and of themselves, they are a recognition of the ongoing colonization of Indigenous peoples who are still here, and they're a predicate for honoring and supporting them in their work for sovereignty and self-determination. I'm so grateful to Lauren Willis and the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History for inviting me to speak as part of the Ideas Untapped seminar series. Though I'm obviously not in Eugene right now, I've been to your campus a few times, and I'm absolutely thrilled to virtually participate in its fantastic community. I know that many of us present may be neither medievalists, nor academics, nor magic scholars, and I want you to encourage those folks to please ask any clarifying questions you'd like during Q&A. I hope that, academics or not, you'll leave today knowing more than you ever thought you would about magic, gender in the Middle Ages. So Lauren introduced me as a scholar of magic and gender, and that's absolutely correct. I know that the exhibit going on today, or going on currently at the museum, focuses a bit more on kind of cultural kind of folk magic traditions in the Middle Ages. But today what I'm focusing on is learned magic and the way that learned magic intersects with gender. And I want to start out today first by asking you, what comes to mind when you hear magic and gender, when you think of those two words? And you're welcome to drop this just in the chat. You can send it to everyone or to hosts and panelists, but just take a minute. I'd love to just like see what your free associations are between magic and gender. What image comes to mind, or what type of image? Great. Yes, witches. Awesome. Getting a lot of witches. Yep. Thank you all so much for typing. Everyone who's typed witches, excellent, because that is what I was hoping you would say. Because that's what I think of when I think of magic and gender. And here we have some popular cultural depictions of them, right? We have this idea, people have also put in the chat, you know, witches with, or like women with pointy hats, sorceresses. And I'm liking also what I'm, for example, Laura, I just saw did a comment, it's a distinction between male sorcerers and alchemists, female witches, right? So this kind of difference perhaps between kind of what is the domain of male magical practitioners and women magical practitioners. And these images that we see, we can see that we have a lot of the popular conceptions, right? Of like an older woman, not very attractive, riding a broom, wearing a pointy hat. Here in this corner, we have women offering children to a demon, right? So that is, I think, kind of the general cultural conception when we kind of think about the gender understanding of witch burning, right? And a lot of folks in the chat have mentioned things like Salem, Massachusetts, and similar practices, or sorry, similar locations that are associated with witch burning in history. But it's important to note that this is a Renaissance, not a medieval craze. Witch burning is not a medieval problem, really. It reached its peak in the 16th century, and it was particularly widespread in Germany, England, and France. The majority of those burned and condemned as witches were women, although men were also condemned, but research has shown that it's mainly women who are the ones who are condemned and then put to death. And most importantly, for the talk that I'm giving today, these witches in the Renaissance were unlearned practitioners. They were not being accused of having gone to university and learned magic and then put it into practice, but these were people who were picking up on local folk traditions and folk healing. But if we go a little earlier, we turn to the Middle Ages, you can see that magic, and particularly learned magic, was considered masculine. And here we have a image of a magician using basically a big pool of water and the reflections in it to sink ships through his magical power. He kind of conjures the image in the big bowl of water and uses that to sink ships. And this image really gives us this understanding, right? Like it's a solo male practice, and you can see that he is dressed as a king, right? So I mean, he is a king. He's a man of high power. And that takes me to the subject of my talk today. I'm just going to give you a brief overview. So I'm just going to start first with what is medieval magic? Then I'm going to turn to the gender of medieval magic, more specifically than just it was masculine. And I'm going to conclude, because I am an English scholar, with two literary case studies. I'm going to look at Melior of Byzantium, who is in the medieval romance Partner of Bois, as well as the medieval sorceress Morgan Le Fay and her depiction in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I have a few guiding questions that structure both my talk today and my project, my dissertation work as a whole. And I want to note that I'm not going to be able to fully answer these in the time that we have today, unfortunately. But if there's anything here that you think I don't cover adequately and you want to know more about in Q&A, please, I welcome the chance to talk more about this. The questions that I'm really considering in my project are, how do cultural anxieties regarding female power surface in medieval magical texts? To what extent does the presence of the supernatural in medieval literature reveal the instability and mutability of supposedly natural gender behavior? And how do such depictions help us think about constructions of and challenges against medieval performances of gender, sexual desire, and sexual practices? So the first question that we're tackling tonight is, what is medieval magic? And I think a good place to kind of understand the medieval conception of magic would be to turn to a condemnation against it in the Vulgate Bible, which was the Latin Bible that was really widespread and commonly used across the medieval Europe. And in this text, it condemns all those who shall sacrifice your son and daughter, leading them through the fire, or who divines from animal entrails, or observes dream and omens, nor let there be any magician, nor charmer, nor anyone who consults the Pythia or fortune tellers, or who seeks the truth from the dead. For all those who do these things are abhorred by God, and because of these sins, he will destroy them at your coming. So you get a conflation here between a lot of different types of practices. It could be someone who actively just consults an oracle. That's what the Pythia is. And you can remember, right, this is coming at a time, the Vulgate Bible was written at a time when there's still culturally the oracle at Delphi, similar sources for divination like that. Those who seek the truth from the dead, that ends up being called necromancy, although I want to put a big asterisk with that because that term becomes pretty fraught throughout the Middle Ages. A charmer and a magician, someone who observes dreams or omens. So there's a lot of different things that kind of come under this category of what is condemnable magical acts. And then these acts get divided into three types of magical power during the Middle Ages. These are natural powers, supernatural powers, and then preternatural powers. So natural power is less controversial. It occurs in nature without external intervention. So this could be something like, for instance, during the Black Death, it was believed that if you crushed emeralds and pearls, these had natural powers within them. They weren't, you weren't saying a spell to make them heal you, but you crush them up and you drink them in a potion, and that would hopefully heal you from the plague. So that would be natural magic, or yes. Then there's supernatural power, which is literally above nature. And this would be something like miracles, the power of God, where the only person who is considered above nature is God in medieval philosophy. And the final form of power that you see in medieval breakdowns of magic is preternatural power. And this is where most learned magic is considered to originate. It is considered beyond or beside nature. It doesn't quite fit into the kind of medieval schema of, where is man's power versus God's power versus sort of natural universe. And I think this kind of fraught definition of magical power demonstrates that magic in the Middle Ages is not a universal definition. It is not a universal standard. It changes depending on what culture you're looking at, whether you're looking at even just the difference between France and England, which have a lot of cultural overlap, and what century you're looking at. So I know that if there are scholars of medieval magic in the audience, they might rightfully note that I'm painting with a pretty broad brush here. Speaking of scholars of medieval magic, the scholar Richard Kiefer has defined the difference between natural and demonic magic, which you can kind of conflate with natural versus preternatural magic, as natural magic relying on hidden powers within nature. It assumes that certain plants, animals, gems, and verbal formulas have power that cannot be explained in ordinary terms, but is nonetheless part of their natural condition and not due to supernatural intervention. While natural magic invokes hidden powers in nature, demonic magic invokes the power of evil spirits. And Kiefer here is speaking about the perception of medieval magic from the point of view of Orthodox authorities. So that means, who the theologians are and the lawmakers of medieval culture. They are concerned about demonic or preternatural forces because they say it has to evoke, or it has to come out of the power of demons. Learned medieval magic, the focus of my talk today, was built upon medieval natural philosophy. And this was a philosophical system that's a precursor to modern science and an integrated scientific understanding with medieval theology. So it was definitely a Christian form of scientific philosophy, but it also grappled with things like, what is the nature of man? How do we define the difference between animals and birds, for instance? A lot of the questions that we are still concerned with. Learned magic required knowledge of the 7 liberal arts, so grammar, rhetoric, logic, geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. And those required academic training. They required you to have the ability to go to the university, to be trained, which was typically restricted, as we're getting to gender, to men. It was generally termed nigromancy or necromancy, and I can talk more about this distinction in Q&A, but basically these are the terms that when you see them in texts, you at least for me, bells go off and say, oh, we're talking about a specific type of magic here. We're talking about learned magic. And that comes from nigromancy, which means black magic, or necromancy, which means death magic. And while these are two different forms of magical practice, because of the similarity in their name, you find that they get interchanged a lot across medieval manuscripts, and often within the same manuscript, they might be using both terms. So the distinction between them is not at all static throughout the Middle Ages. And it's important to note that the practitioners themselves denied they summoned demons. They were not convinced that what they were doing was anything bad, or at least rhetorically, they would not depict it as such in their handbooks. And that takes me, I'd like to take a minute to look at how gender was depicted, or how it was implicitly categorized in magical handbooks. So I'm turning here to the Liberatus Onori E, or the Sworn Book of Honorius, which is a 13th century magical handbook. And it starts out by saying, this is a 17th century English translation, this book should be delivered to no man until such time as the master of the art were in jeopardy of death, and that it should be copied but unto 3 at the most, and that it should be delivered to no woman, nor to any man except if he were of lawful age, which should also be both godly and faithful, whose godly behavior had been tried by the space of a whole year. So this definition tell us? First, that magic knowledge needs to be restricted and is only appropriate for kind of the most elite learners, right? Only 3 at the most, and it should only be transmitted upon pain of death. But it also tells us what a good magician is. And a good magician is overwhelmingly, first of all, male. Second, of adult age, of the ability to reason and learn. And you'd have to be, right? Because as we just learned medieval magic requires a university education, and you're not going to get that by the age of 13 or 14. You have to have a proven moral character, which I always find fascinating, given that magicians were often accused of being immoral, right? Religiously devout. He says you have to have, or the book says you have to have godliness and faithfulness, and you have to demonstrate your godly behavior for the space of a year. So there's clear restrictions here in terms of who gets to do learned magic. And even though, let's say, a church theologian like Thomas Aquinas might say, hey, all magic that you're doing is bad and inappropriate. The magical practitioners themselves, in terms of their self-fashioning, are identifying themselves as a group of learned, godly, faithful male practitioners. Now, what do medieval theologians and magicians have to say about the role of women in magic? Well, the theologian Bertrand of Worms says in the 11th century that some wicked women, turning back to Satan and seduced by the illusions and phantasms of demons, believe that in the night hours they ride upon certain animals with the pagan goddess Diana and a countless multitude of women, and they cross a great span of the world in the stillness of the dead of night. And this is one of the earliest medieval depictions of what we can now kind of identify as traces of what becomes depictions of witches, right? This idea of women traveling in groups at night. Here they're riding on animals as opposed to brooms, but there's still that sense that this is a kind of a woman's enterprise, and that the woman's enterprise is delusional, right? They're seduced by the illusions and phantasms of demons. Unlike men who have to be themselves godly and faithful and demonstrate that, and that they are the one in charge of the art within their books, women instead do not have the ability to determine truth from false. They instead are susceptible to Satan and his minions, and instead they fall into superstition. And you can see that superstition referenced by the pagan goddess Diana, because we're talking about a Christian framework here. So generally, then, women's magic was associated with a couple of different things. Infertility and impotence. There were accusations throughout the Middle Ages that really reached their height in the early modern period in the witch burning craze, that perhaps women were causing infertility for their neighbors or impotence. Also poisons, and our kind of common understanding of like poison as a woman's weapon. That's, I think, if you're a fan of murder mysteries, it's often something that's thrown around. That really comes from this medieval understanding of like women as associated with magic and poisons. Superstition, which we just saw in that example about the pagan goddess Diana, and a lack of agency and learning. So if you're really doing serious magic that's not superstition based, that is considered by at least some practitioners who are able to write books licit and authoritative and powerful, women are completely excluded from that power. Now, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, I work on literature, and literature is exciting for a number of different reasons, one of which is that it provides alternatives to reality in terms of what can be imagined. And I want to spend the last portion of my talk today turning to two figures of literary women magicians. They are learned magicians, and they feature in two different texts. Excuse me. The first figure probably has some name recognition, Morgan Le Fay. She was called in the text Sir Gawain and the Green Knight the goddess of hot dessert. And although there is a large body of work on Morgan Le Fay, and I'm happy to touch on some of that in Q&A, I'm going to focus today just on her depiction in one text, the late 14th century English romance, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I'm just going to focus briefly on how she's depicted. If you have recently seen the film The Green Knight, this was a modern adaptation. And I would also be happy to talk in Q&A about how they depicted female authority and power, because that's just something that's really struck me. But Morgan Le Fay is probably the most famous woman magician from the Middle Ages. And then I'm going to turn from Morgan to a virtually unknown woman magician, but she was the star of a medieval bestseller, the romance Partenopée Bois, that although it has not really been translated or discussed much in modernity, features in over a dozen extant manuscripts from the Middle Ages, and was again translated into over 6 languages. It transmitted across the global Middle Ages. It was a widely popular text, and it features Melior, who was both the Empress of Byzantium, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, and was also a learned woman magician. And this text comes from the early 15th century in England. Now, these two texts tell very different stories. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is concerned with the titular two characters of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It takes place at Christmas, and you can see in the manuscript image that I've depicted here, you have the Green Knight is a man all in green, riding a green horse, facing Sir Gawain. In the course of the romance, the Green Knight issues a challenge to Sir Gawain to chop off his head or to give a stroke of a weapon and receive the same in a year and a day. Gawain cuts off his head, thinks that would be the end of it, but the Green Knight continues to live and says, I'll see you in a year. The romance is mostly preoccupied with Gawain's journey across England and finding the Green Knight, and it doesn't really seem to center Morgan at all until the very end of the text, when his host, the Green Knight, reveals himself to also be the lord of the castle where Gawain had spent his last few days, hot dessert. And he says, although I am technically the lord of the castle, everything that's happened here has been due to the magical power of Morgan Le Fay. And this is a really unique text. So I'm going to get to that more in a minute, but I just want to give you that plot summary because it reveals its woman's power at the very end, and it changes your entire reading of the romance. Compare that to Partenope of Blois, which centers its woman's magical power from the very beginning. Melior, like I mentioned, Empress of Byzantium, brings Partenope, the titular character, to her magical city in the Empire of Byzantium. And there she keeps him basically as her trapped lover for 2 years. And she does all of this through her magical power. She creates, a world that he loves so much he cannot remember his own past. However, throughout the course of the romance, he eventually remembers his past. He returns home to France. He almost betrays her multiple times. And yet, even though the plot so far seems like Melior wouldn't be the hero of the romance does end with Partenope forsaking his past, gleefully and happily accepting Melior as his wife and ascending to her co-throne as her consort. So even though the ethics of how she gets with Partenope are perhaps fraught, she's definitely celebrated in that text as using her magical power for good, at least for her own ends. Positive. So Morgan Le Fay, like I mentioned, has been depicted in a lot of different texts, but in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, when Gawain comes to hot dessert right before he's trying to find the Green Knight to complete their game, he sees this unnamed woman, and I'm just going to read it in translation, but this is the Middle English here. Okay, so there is the lady of the castle, Lady Bertilac, who sat on the left hand, but on the right hand, there was an older woman, an ancient, it seemed, and highly honored with servants all around her. These two women were really unlike one another. The old woman had rough, wrinkled cheeks, had a gorger, kind of like a neckerchief, geared over her neck. It was chimbled over her black chin, which she had lots of veils over her chin. Her front was covered in silk. She was covered with fabric trifles so that all that you could see was her black brows, her 2 eyes, her nose, and the naked lips, all of which were sour to see and bleary. A mensk lady, which means a high lady in the world, you might call her, even though her body was short and broad, her buttocks big and broad, and she was less beautiful to look on than the woman next to her, but she sat in the highest of seats. So this description you only learn at the very end of the romance is referring to Morgan. But what we can pick out of this description are a couple of different things. One, she is an old and unattractive lady, which gets picked up later on in our understandings of witches that we saw in those initial images, right? Okay, women who are learned or women who use magic, they can't also be beautiful. At least this text seems to be saying. She has servants all around her and holds the highest position in her court. So even though this woman is hideous to look at and is not nearly as beautiful as the woman who's right next to her, she also maintains the highest form of authority. And you can see this by the trappings around her, even though she's not named, which is an authorial decision, right? That kind of takes away power from her by not giving this person a name. You don't let the audience identify them or recognize them. But even though she is so horrific, she is also incredibly powerful. And when the text eventually reveals her identity at the close, it makes it extremely clear that, in fact, she's not just the most powerful in the court, but perhaps in that entire land. The Green Knight reveals himself and says that I am Bertilac of Hot Desert, that's what I'm called in this land, but through the might of Morgan Le Fay that lives in my house and who has the knowledge of clergy, or of learned clerics by crafts well learned, has taken the masteries of Merlin, for those two people had lived together for some time, who knows all of your knights at home. Morgan the goddess, therefore, that is her name. There's no one who is so haughty that she cannot tame. So finally, we're given a name for that hideous yet powerful woman in the previous scene. And it's very clear that she is kind of confused in her status. On the one hand, she is a goddess, right? That repeats what we saw earlier, that she's in the highest realm of the position of court. And yet she learns that power from Merlin. So she has to get that knowledge from someone else. And that kind of replicates this learning system of magic that I talked about, right? Where you have to have training in the liberal arts, which implies a university education. Although Morgan here doesn't have access to a university education, she's definitely fitting into a male magical knowledge system, right? She's receiving knowledge from the male magus, Merlin. There's a lot of alliteration. And it's through her might, through her power, and through her crafts, well learned, right? Not through superstition, not through the power of demons, but it's clearly Morgan who is in control here. Morgan has the ability to tame haughtiness. That's what that high hot test at the end means. Morgan can use her magic to A, accomplish her own ends, but B, put people in their place. That is, Morgan has the power of class and authority because of her magical power that she gains from learned men. This is a good place to turn to Melior, the Empress and magician, who in Parthenope described a couple of different ways. The first is from her own perspective, and she says that my father, the Emperor of Byzantium, had no heir but me, and so he took great heed of me, and he sent me to school that I might better govern the kingdom. So already, like Morgan, Melior occupies the highest position in court. She is the heir of Byzantium, the empire, right? She has to rule it herself, so she needs to have book learning. Now, unlike Morgan, however, Melior is extremely attractive. She's later described as incredibly beautiful. Each man is glad to see her. They marvel greatly at her beauty. She is fair shape and freshly clad. She is womanly in her comportion. And it's kind of a weird term here, but her cure is sad. So she has, maybe a melancholy disposition, yet she is incredibly beautiful. Now, this text sets up a little bit of opposition to the figure of Morgan that we see, right? They're both highly powerful, and yet Melior is beautiful while Morgan is hideous. Sorry to Morgan. However, Melior has even more training than Morgan does. And I'm going to again summarize here because I know it is hard to read the Middle English. And that C refers to 100. 100 masters I had and more, and God gave me grace to learn so, that the 7 sciences, aka liberal arts, I could know better. And after then I learned to know the earth and her virtue, all manner of spices I know by rote, and how in physic or medicine they work, so I can heal the sick. After this, I learned divinity, to know the persons of the Trinity. By then, I was 15 years of age. My masters, who were both wise and sage, in all these 7 arts, I had surpassed them. Finally, then, I was sent to necromancy or nigromancy, where I learned enchantments, to know the craft of experiments. So this romance is really unique, and I have not yet found another romance that does this. It really lays down the formal art of learning for men in actual university systems of how you would go about gaining that knowledge of necromancy, right? You have to learn divinity, you have to learn the earth and her virtues, aka natural philosophy, you need to know medicine, right? All 7 of these arts are necessary. Melior here, I haven't even seen a male magus in a medieval text depicted in the same way where it's so outlined. So here the text seems to suggest that Melior, because she has this very formal training and has the need for knowledge, right? Because she is the heir of Byzantium. She has the ability to have this knowledge and have it licitly. We're not seeing any condemnation of Melior in the text, right? To go back to that previous depiction of her, this is at the very end when everyone is seeing her. They're all glad on her to see. No one is saying, oh, Melior, you are the most hideous woman in the kingdom. But she very clearly has this knowledge of magic. And this knowledge is what makes it possible for her to facilitate her romance with Partenope, because she uses that power to bring Partenope to Byzantium. She uses that power to trick him into staying. And she uses that power to basically get what she wants, which is the partner of her choice, as opposed to an arranged marriage. So both Melior and Morgan master learned magic from men and exceed their teacher's authority. We see that with Morgan and Merlin, and we see that with Melior and her 100+ masters, right? She says by the time she's 15, she has completely exceeded them. And then they use their magical training to further their own ends. So for Morgan, right, she brings about the entire game that drives the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. For Melior, she brings Partenope to her lands and seduces him. And most importantly and most uniquely, they are celebrated by their texts for their power rather than condemned, right? If you were a medieval theologian like Bertrand of Worms writing this, you might say, no, these women are superstitious, are being deceived, are not demonstrating that they have any sort of agency or authority for themselves. But in these literary texts, they have the ability to push beyond the boundaries of normative medieval gendered behavior. So again, I know I only have a limited amount of time today. This takes me sort of to my wrap up. But I just want to leave you guys with some larger takeaways. First, though medieval women were considered unsuitable for magic in real life, that is in medieval cultural conceptions and in medieval discussions of magic, they can illicitly exceed male mastery in literature. And I hope that this talk has gotten you really interested in these 2 texts, Sir Gawain and Partenope of Law, and I'm happy to talk more about them and point you to where you can go check them out more, because I think they're really exciting examples. Second, literature becomes a space wherein authors and thinkers can question cultural assumptions of gender and power. And that seems pretty obvious to us today, but there's a real debate right now within medieval studies about, where can we identify the creation of fiction? Where can we identify breakages from our modern understandings of sex and gender and our past understandings of sex and gender? But what I'm hoping to demonstrate throughout my project and through my talk today is that literature, even in the Middle Ages, plays with and draws upon the imaginative capacity of writers and thinkers to push beyond gendered norms that are otherwise inviolate. Even these depictions require male instruction. Both Melior and Morgan are very carefully and very explicitly noted to be trained by men, right? They can't just learn it of their own accord, suggesting that even literature has its boundaries regarding female authority. And in my larger dissertation project from which this comes, that's what I'm trying to trace. I'm trying to trace those boundaries of where is it possible to say that magic works as a subversive function in terms of gender and sexuality versus where does it reify or uphold certain medieval conceptions of what we would today consider normative gender behavior of like, this is what is appropriate for men to do versus appropriate for women to do. At the start of my talk today, I said that I hope that today you would come away with learning more about medieval magic and gender than you ever thought possible. And so I just wanted to leave you guys with this final question again that I asked, which is, what do you think about when you think magic and gender? My hope is that you realize it's a lot more complicated than simply one or the other, masculine or feminine. And that, in fact, a lot of our popular cultural conceptions of what it means to be a witch or even a woman comes back to these earlier definitions and depictions. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to Q&A and hearing what questions you all have for me.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. That was excellent. So far, we have just a couple of questions that have come in. So I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, you can, if you're joining us on Zoom, you can ask them in either the Q&A or the chat. If you're watching the live stream on Facebook, you can ask it there in the comments section, and we'll be collecting your questions across that platform as well. So we have a clarifying question that I want to start with, a simple one to get you going. Is Morgan the character that in later literature is referred to as Morgana?
Yes, that's a great clarifying question. So yes, those two characters are, I wouldn't say necessarily synonymous, but they're definitely the same. They're conflated, right? Like they are basically the same. There's a larger tradition in medieval literature of kind of the Morgan figure. So that kind of dates back to Irish literature and the depiction of the Morrigan, who was a female fairy figure that had a lot of kind of positive and negative power, to then the depiction of Morgan Le Fay, who is so called not necessarily because she was, if you speak French, a fairy, which is what Le Fay means, but because in the romance that she was first referred to as such, because she was a wise woman who knew healing. And that's in the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, if any of you guys are medieval lit fans. And then to the figure Morgan in the sister of, or the half sister of Arthur, who then gets picked up, for example, in Mists of Avalon, right? The kind of modern figure of Morgana or Morgan absolutely is all part of this same character tradition, definitely.
So I'll give you another somewhat simple one. Were Melior and Morgan real historical figures?
They sadly were not. And it's such a bummer because they're so cool. But definitely they were not real figures. And I think that some of the best evidence for that, and if I had an additional hour today, I'd be happy to go into it. I had a whole bunch of slides about it and had to delete it. About like what happened when real women were accused of magical practice, and it did not end well for them. They were not treated licitly like Morgan and Melior in these texts. And in fact, there isn't really any evidence that there was a single, sole ruler of Byzantium. So these are definitely the products of imaginative literature, which is really cool, but unfortunately not identifiable in the historical record.
So these romances that you shared at the end, were they part of a tradition of the Troubadours? And if so, what do you feel is the influence? And you are muted.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So medieval romance as a genre largely does come out of eventually the troubadour tradition. Troubadours are kind of writing and singing more in the 12th century and 11th century, especially across southern France. But there is thought that the old French romance Pardon of Bois, that the Middle English text that I was talking about today, that was written in the 12th century. And a lot of the same language that the troubadours use about courtly love, especially, and sort of the framework of how does love function between a man and a woman and what drives love. And a lot of the same, I would say, lyrical quality, because romance, like troubadour lyrics, is poetry. A lot of that influence can be seen. I would say, I don't think I could point to a specific, troubadour song and say, here is the figure of Morgan Le Fay, but I can say that the lyricism of the troubadour songs, their emphasis on kind of courtly love and gendered behavior, and their focus on imaginative play are all things that you can definitely pick up on in later medieval texts like these.
So why did literature become a space where cultural assumptions could be challenged? And maybe this is just a in your opinion type of question. And then were medieval women big readers, or was it assumed that, quote, lesser men did not read, so it was a safe space for progressive men?
That's a great question. And this is definitely something that I'm trying to figure out in my project. I would say that why literature becomes a place of experimentation kind of goes to this larger question of what is fiction and where does fiction kind of originate and how and why, you know? I would say for my project and my understanding really is that just as we kind of cultures have told stories going back to, you know, ancient Greece and the kind of stories of Homer where you imagine worlds or interactions with gods or nature that aren't otherwise actually possible. There are ways of explaining the unknown or explaining cultural difference. And I think that that is one reason why literature becomes such a place of experimentation, right? To go back to the other question of like, were these real people? They weren't real people, but there was something about these stories that clearly captured the audience's imagination that made them really interesting sources. And I would say too, I think that's such an interesting thing about like, oh, it's like the most progressive men who are reading, because literacy in the Middle Ages is very restricted. A lot of these stories, especially the earlier romances, were produced primarily orally. So you might have, let's say, like a minstrel, and this kind of picks up or echoes the troubadour tradition, read these stories or speak these stories aloud. And that's how the court would interpret them. By the 15th century and by this version of Partenope, we're probably looking at folks like actually sitting down and reading the text. But if you think about who actually has access to that knowledge, it is mostly learned men who occupy the upper echelon of society. However, by the 15th century, we definitely have evidence of women, you know, engaging in literary production. For example, Kristin is a fantastic medieval authoress who, if you're interested in kind of seeing more about women writers or women self-fashioning, that's a great author to start with. Also, Marie de France, one of my medieval favorites. So yes, I would say that the answer is it is complicated, and it kind of plays into these larger conversations about, you know, what is the role of literature culturally. But I think it's great that you're asking it, so thank you.
So someone is first off thanking you for your talk, and also just asking, bringing it back to Morgan Le Fay and how the text that you provided as an example was praising her for her power rather than criticizing her for it. This person is wondering if that is the case for all texts that mention her, because from their understanding of some of the retellings of Arthurian legends, she got a feeling that Morgan Le Fay was kind of the evil person in those stories. So is this just a simplified interpretation of those stories that kind of made it appear that way, or is the Morgan Le Fay character presented differently in different texts?
That is an awesome question, because Morgan is definitely a complicated figure throughout medieval literature. In some texts, for instance, like in her earlier depiction in Ewain and Gawain, which is a Middle English, but deriving from a French romance, Morgan is a healer who provides a potion that heals one of Arthur's knights. But in other texts, for example, if you're familiar with the Morte d'Arthur, she is absolutely an antagonist to Arthur's reign. And I think it's totally possible, you know, I'm presenting my reading of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and using the text, you know, saying like, look, this woman who would otherwise be condemned, at least within Hot Desert, they are celebrating her. It is possible, you know, Gawain, the character, does not respond as positively. Gawain himself, he has a lot of feelings throughout. I think that, you know, her own positionality is not even black and white in that text, right? Like as we get with that confusing depiction of her being hideous and ugly. So not, you know, especially in a time that kind of conflates physical appearance with moral behavior, right? The suggestion there is that she's dangerous or in some way, and yet also highly honored. So yes, your question's a great one. Definitely a complex figure that and sometimes is treated as positive, sometimes is treated as negative.
So we did have a question come in from our curator of the Magic in Medieval Europe exhibit, Martha Bayless, who says that one thing that strikes her is that fairy women were supposed to be supernaturally beautiful and witches are depicted as horrendously ugly. And then she notes that, isn't this weird? And also obnoxious. And is wondering how you think the authorities managed to enforce this change.
Yeah, this is a great point. For those of you who have encountered maybe other forms of medieval literature, like I was talking about, for instance, Marie de France earlier, these authors will absolutely depict women who have magical power, who are kind of innately born with it, aka fairies, exactly as Martha says, inherently beautiful. Witches and kind of early modern witches, especially, I think, are depicted as hideously ugly. And a place that I'd like to kind of pinpoint where this might originate from is the loathly lady tradition of medieval literature. And so this is something, because I don't think that it is universal that learned female practitioners are depicted as hideous, and we not just to be like, Melior, who I just described, but other instances of women who are kind of taking this on. Sometimes they're dangerous because they're so beautiful, because they are in less of a similar, like in a way that implies perhaps that they are using their magic to enhance their beauty, or there's something about that can be dangerous. But the loathly lady tradition is something that originates in medieval romance that tells the story of a woman that is hideous and typically ugly. And she, for some reason or another, encounters the hero. For example, one famous version is the story of Dame Ragnell, who Gawain is accused of rape in Camelot. He is, and his punishment is, to determine what women want most in the world and go out into the world. And he goes out in the world, tries to find out what it is. He can't figure out the answer, can't solve it. And finally, he runs into this most hideous woman he's ever seen. And she says, I can give you the secret. I know what the answer is, but you have to promise to marry me. And he's like, well, either I do this or I die. So he takes the answer. And she says that what women want most is to be in charge of their own destiny, which rings pretty true in 2021 as well. And he gives that answer at court. He is correct. He is no longer under threat of death. And when she arrives to marry him, he's like, oh, I can't believe I have to marry this hideous woman. And yet that night, she asks him, or she appears to him as a beautiful woman and says, all right, now you get to choose. Do you want me hideous or do you want me beautiful? And whatever you choose is how I'll be. And the point is that he's hopefully learned from this experience. And he says, what women want is to be in control of their own destiny. I will let you choose. And she chooses to be beautiful. And this is a story that, might be familiar to folks who love fairy tales. It's kind of a similar one that gets told again and again. But I think this is one that really connects this idea of magical woman with hideousness, with deceiving men. And it is one that really gets taken up past that time as well.
Thank you. So someone is bringing it back to this discussion about how in the two examples that you presented, women are learning this knowledge from men who were perhaps at the time the only legitimate ones to learn that and be able to share it. So when the women learn from these men, they're asking why that didn't translate per se into those women being welcomed into the scholarly community, or situations where women would maybe have then turned to teach other women the liberal arts and sciences that you mentioned.
Interesting question. Yes. So this is definitely something that is only possible within the fictional realm, because although there is some evidence that some women, and by some I mean like a handful of women throughout several centuries, were able to get some form of a university education, were able to learn some things whether it relates to medical practice or something like that, there is a real concerted effort on the part of the male authorities to maintain and exclude that knowledge. For example, you remember that sworn Book of Honorius quote I started with that says, keep this to only 3 people. That is pretty much the same sense as the universities, right? Keep this to the elite folks, AKA the folks who either have the money to go to university or who have the theological training and aptitude to be sponsored and learn. And this is not something that is meant for everyone. I mean, this is a time when the Bible was not something that everyone could read, right? And it was very purposefully kept not in the vernacular so that not everyone could have access to it. So when you're talking about a society like that, this isn't something where education of women is celebrated or is even a common thing. In fact, it would have been, I think, kind of a medieval theologian's worst nightmare if a group of women got together and started talking about magic or talked about these arts, right? Like that would be something that would be completely unacceptable, because during this period, right, although these literary texts provide us versions of femininity that are autonomous, the lived reality of women was much less autonomous than these texts portray. And I think that's what's so interesting about them, and why I'm drawn to them, is trying to figure out, why are these male authors who are kind of part of this system that maintains this strict dichotomy between masculine and feminine authority and power, why are they invested in depicting these women who have this individual power, who have this ability to kind of control their own destiny through magic? And it's really interesting. I'm not sure that I have a solid answer yet.
So we have a question that's a little bit tangential to the talk tonight, but I did say in your intro that you are also interested in the history of science. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it and see if you have some thoughts on this. So someone is saying that they read that the historians of science say that part of the roots of experimental science lie in the efforts to distinguish between what's a miracle, perhaps God's action, or maybe magic, and what is natural. Thoughts on this? Or do you have have you ever heard of this before?
I would say that this is roughly accurate. Yeah, I would say that, as I was talking about the breakdown of those 3 forms of power, right? That's something that medieval natural philosophers spent a lot of time and a lot of ink writing about, trying to determine, how do you determine whether something is natural, whether something is supernatural, whether something is preternatural, excuse me. Sorry, my own thought, right? And that's something that, medieval natural philosophers were engaging in, both in terms of experimental science, like they were, actually engaging in experimentation, and also kind of interpreting and learning from the scholars that had come before, because there very much was an emphasis in medieval university learning of kind of reifying the knowledge of previous scholars, as opposed to kind of saying they're wrong and I'm learning something new. I think that the only caveat that I have about that claim is that it kind of positions medieval scientists as inherently, I guess, more superstitious or than kind of modern experiential science. And I hope that my answer is demonstrated it's a bit more of a continuum than that. So I would just say that, like, I think that historians of science, especially, there's like some debate in the field of history of science between folks who work kind of on more modern histories of science, kind of post 1800, and folks that work pre 1800, and really want to drive home that, like, it's not a either or. It's not that there was one form of scientific experimentation that was dumb in the Middle Ages and one that is like much more logical now. That in fact, a lot of the same questions that we're trying to answer in 2021 preoccupied medieval folks too.
All right, so we are coming up on the end of time. So we have one more question that we can squeeze in, and it's a big one. So someone is wondering where they should start if they want to learn about the origin of magic. So if you want to narrow that down to maybe like your favorite example of a starter text or something related to the origin of magic.
So I work on medieval magic, so I'm going to keep my answer to like a great primer text for the origin of medieval magic, or like, and this will also kind of give you good resources for earlier forms of magic, right? So that way you can kind of see where is medieval magic coming from. I'm going to put it in the chat too. The author is Richard Kiekefer, and his book is called, fittingly enough, Magic in the Middle Ages. It's written for an undergrad audience, so it's pretty darn accessible. If you're someone who is not looking for a draining academic read, do not worry. It's short, it is clear, it's really helpful. Richard Kiekefer is kind of one of the founders of medieval magical study, which is a cool field to be able to talk about, I guess. And this book, it really covers everything from, learned practitioners to, for example, I saw someone in the chat or someone in the Q&A was asking about kind of like hedge witch figures, like he touches on that as well. I think that he really does a great overview of all of the different forms that magic takes in the Middle Ages, the differentiations between them, and also a great bibliography of like where to go after you read his book. So that's definitely, I would say, the go-to text. And like I said, I put that in the chat. So if you didn't hear it or you're wondering how to spell that last name, Kiekefer, just take a look and hopefully it is a useful resource.
Well, thank you so much again, Kirsty. Thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight and joined us for Ideas on Tap. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I see lots of thanks coming in through the chat. So in the webinar, it's just the two of us, but imagine the whole room is applauding for you. We always joke that we should get an applause track that I can play at the end of these. Maybe we'll do it sometime before we go back to having these in person again. So I hope everyone has a great evening and thank you all again.